Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to Nova Scotia's chapter of National Accessibility Week. We have a really special presentation today, and I hope you were able to join in and tune into some of our other presentations throughout the week and some of the workshops. They've been really great and really information-based, and I know they've been educational for myself as well, someone who is familiar with the field. So I hope you were able to tune in and catch some of the stuff we had this week. If not, that's okay. All of the stuff that we have aired is going to be available on our YouTube channel. So if you head over to YouTube and search reachAbility Association, you'll see all of the NAAW 2021 events there that we have hosted. And if you're not able to stay for the whole time today, that's okay, because it will be available on YouTube, but also it's going to be aired as well tomorrow at 10 a.m. So if you're not able to stay for the whole time today, or you just catch a little bit, you can join us tomorrow as well at 10 a.m. So our presentation today is called Opening Doors for Everyone, also known as ODE. And the reason this is such a special thing for reachAbility is because this is a program that we used to offer. So we started Opening Doors for Everyone in 2018 as a response to Nova Scotia getting its Accessibility Act. And the question was, we have this act, all of this forward-thinking direction and information, but what are we going to do with it? How are we going to get it out there so that people know that Nova Scotia, A, has its own act, but B, is really dedicated and committed to getting the act implemented and making sure that it's appropriate for everyone. And so our wonderful CEO, Tova Sherman, she said, reachAbility can do that. We can spread the word. We can get it out there. We already do this work. We already work with this community. And so we did the Opening Doors for Everyone presentation all across Nova Scotia for about 3 years. And so we're excited to be presenting it again with new and updated 2021 information. So welcome. If you've already joined our events, welcome back. My name's Amanda, and I'm one of the program coordinators at reachAbility. So if you're unfamiliar with reachAbility, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about us throughout the week if you've joined, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our reachAbility method. And one of the things our CEO likes to promote is that we offer many services to the few. So we work with the disability community in Metro, in Nova Scotia, and instead of offering a bunch of services, or a little bit of services to a bunch of people, we offer a bunch of services to the disability community. And so what we currently provide is employment support. So we have 2 programs for people who are looking for employment-related support or brushing up on those employment skills. We also offer self-development programs. So we have our One Step Closer program and our BOSS program that helps people develop these soft or personal skills that are also helpful in the workplace as well. We also have our legal services, which is where reachAbility started 20 years ago. And of course, we are hosting for the 3rd year National Accessibility Week here in Nova Scotia. So thank you so much for joining us. If you want to learn more about reachAbility, you can head on over to our website, reachability.org, and take a browse there at everything we offer. One of the other things that we offer at reachAbility that oftentimes our clients don't really get to learn about, but our business partners and our community partners can be very aware of, is something called IIA, which stands for Inclusion in Action Training. And this training is provided by our CEO, who has over 25 years experience working with the disability community and is a first-person voice, so a representative for this wonderful community. And her stance for the Inclusion in Action training is that even if we remove all of these architectural barriers in the workplace and in our communities, without the education and training and really the knowledge, the attitudinal barriers will still remain. And what we're seeing is that we are doing and implementing all of these great, structural updates and building code updates, which is absolutely necessary. But we're still finding these attitudinal barriers, which is these kind of assumptions that people can unconsciously and unintentionally make about persons living with disabilities. And so the goal of this program today too is to help challenge those old mindsets that don't come from a bad place, but oftentimes really do have difficult consequences for people in the disability community. So what we do is we train businesses to help challenge that mindset, those old stigmas and biases that many of us don't even know we still carry. So if you are interested in learning about the training that we provide, so we not only serve the disability community, but people who are impacted by and also impact the disability community. So employers and community organizations as well. So some examples of what inclusion in action training could be, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many different modules, and also inclusion in action training is buildable. So if your business or organization needs specific training on inclusion or disability awareness or accessibility knowledge, please reach out to us because we can build that as well. So some examples of inclusion in action training could be diversity awareness, disability in the hospitality industry, very popular as we have a lot of clients who work in that industry, mental health in the workplace, accommodation and assessment in the workplace and beyond. So how to look at accommodation from a 2021 lens, in which we're going to talk about a little bit today too, because accommodation can be one of those scary things that is unnecessarily scary. It doesn't need to be scary. It's actually a really wonderful thing when you're able to provide it. Hiring and retaining diverse employees. So if you've been inspired through all of this wonderful NAAW work that we've done this week and want to learn how you can get involved as a business or an employer, certainly reach out to us, because that's something that, first of all, we have clients who are always looking, but second of all, we can do some training in how to really incorporate the disability community in your hiring and retaining practices. And the last one, which is one of my personal favorites, our CEO is going to laugh at that one, but work-life balance, which is probably one of the most fun training modules I've ever had the experience of taking part in. So let us know, reach out to us, and if any of this interests you or your business and organization has any training needs, please reach out and let us know. I want to start today by showing a video, one of my favorite videos that reachAbility has ever filmed. And this is a video from 2015, and it was made for Elections Nova Scotia, because their focus in 2015 was, we want to make sure that we are being inclusive and accessible because people have the right to vote. And so reachAbility responded with this video talking about accessibility and hopefully challenging that old definition about what people often immediately assume accessibility means. So let's take a look.
I usually expect to be challenged somewhere along the way.
When I disclose the fact that I have anxiety and depression, I feel like maybe people might not take me as seriously.
I feel like I'm judged as soon as I walk in.
Projection of stereotypes.
Hey, I don't see a disability. You must be making it up.
The overwhelming judgment that comes along with my headscarf.
I identify as transmasculine, genderqueer.
My name is Dancing Deer.
I have a lot of invisible barriers that prevent me from doing a lot of the normal mainstream things as everybody else.
Most likely my heart's racing. I might be sweating, a little bit of a chill, and I'm trying to pull myself together.
My challenges are hidden and people don't see.
It's hard to know how to act in pretty much any situation, because I have no idea what other people assume of me.
People automatically assume that, I can't speak English, or they assume that I'm not from here.
Almost like an othering, feeling like I don't really belong.
Just assume that I'm not like everyone else.
Every noise, every color is brighter, every noise is louder.
I have people tell me I'm in the wrong washroom. I have people yell at me. I've had people start crying.
Why can't you? She goes, that's part of your job.
I felt like there was about maybe 1 million people in that one small room. I knew that my reaction was not what I had felt before.
I feel alienated in my own home because I'm supposed to feel comfortable in Scotia, but I don't.
There's all kinds of a lot of racism, I think, that's been passed down systemically and structurally in society and how people view you.
It felt like the walls were closing in on me.
I'll avoid certain stores. I'll avoid certain people. I'll avoid certain workplaces for sure.
It really takes a toll on you, and it's very difficult to have to be able to walk away.
And that everyone was staring at me.
I would just feel like all that's coming at me all at once. Why don't you go back to your country, foreigner?
So I'm going to be challenged by every single person I have to interact with. And it's too frustrating. It's not worth it. It's not worth the emotional toll that takes.
I'm very selective to who I want to invite to become part of my life.
Feeling like their voice is inadequate because it's been minimized, I guess, for so long.
I don't want to have to explain every time.
To ask, to not make assumptions, using clear, concise sentences, encouraging me to take a breath.
When I meet eyes with you, you don't shun away. When I smile at you, you smile back. When I wave at you, you wave.
Asking the questions. Is there anyone that needs any specific help? Did anyone require a place to sit?
I am more than my gender. There's a lot more things that we can talk about.
Oh, that person thinks I'm normal too.
When I think about it being a better place and I think about it being comfortable for me.
Just be yourself and treat people who you see that are different or aren't welcome. Just treat them how you would want to be treated.
Being greeted with a really smiling face.
Smiling at me.
Being a person and treating another person with the same respect that you would want to be treated with.
Such a simple action that doesn't really take much thought, but it does make such a big difference because
It's my right to vote, and it's a democratic process I want to be a part of.
I am very passionate about voting.
democracy is very important to me. I'm a political science student, so.
But what we want is to be able to have an opportunity to do things like everybody else.
I love that video because it really showcases the point that when we implement accessibility and inclusion practices, it doesn't just exclusively benefit the disability community, it benefits us all. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, which is the benefits and utility of becoming more accessible. And oftentimes when people think about accessibility, they think about, the infrastructure and the physical elements, and that is so important and absolutely baseline and necessary. But what is often forgotten is, again, like our CEO talks about, those attitudinal barriers, right? Those old assumptions and stereotypes that do create real barriers for people. And so as we get going here, keep this video in mind, in the back of your mind, in terms of challenging ourselves to expand our box of understanding of what accessibility and inclusion truly means. Also, if anyone has any questions throughout this seminar, we're going to do a Q&A with myself afterward. So if you want to, head on over to YouTube and you can type the comments in the comment section. And one of my lovely coworkers is actually going to text those to me. So if anyone has any comments and they want to address them in the Q&A at the end, you can certainly do that in that way. So head on over to YouTube and put the comments underneath in this ODE seminar in the comment boxes, and I will answer them at the end to the best of my ability. And if I can't, I will certainly find someone who can. So today we are focused on persons living with disabilities, the disability community here in Nova Scotia. So just to reiterate, one of those points made in the video is that, some disabilities we can see with our eyes, they're obvious to us. Some of them, not so much. And I love this image. If you're a visual learner like myself, it really kind of solidifies that point that, yes, sometimes we can see that somebody has a barrier, but oftentimes we can't. And when we talk about disability statistics here in Nova Scotia, which I'm going to get into, you'll see that a lot of hidden or invisible disabilities actually represent a large portion of the disability community. So this comes from the novascotia.ca website on disability statistics here in Nova Scotia. So this is provincially specific. So in Nova Scotia, out of persons with disabilities, almost 20% are pain related, just over 14% are flexibility related, Just over 13% are mobility related, and almost 12% are mental health related. And you'll see some other categories here as well. So dexterity, hearing, seeing, memory, learning, and developmental disabilities. So we have all of these different categories. Some of them are physical and some of them are cognitive. And oftentimes the cognitive ones go unseen or unnoticed because people, A, don't know they're struggling, but B, it's less obvious, right? It's a less obvious thing. And so we've come to this kind of place where we understand that, okay, we have a lot of people who require accommodations and inclusion practices. So our forward-thinking province here in Nova Scotia recognizes the need for inclusive properties, objectives, and goals. And that was one of the main reasons why we implemented our own Accessibility Act. In fact, did you know, you might have heard these statistics before, but just as a nice reminder, 30% of Nova Scotians who are 15 years and older have at least one disability. This actually represents the highest disability rate in Canada. So 30%, that's almost a third of our population, 1 in 3 almost. Nova Scotia has one of the highest percentages of senior citizens per capita, right after New Brunswick and Newfoundland. Seems to be a maritime thing. We have an aging population here. So even when we talk about, accessibility and inclusion benefiting people with disabilities, senior citizens, we know that they can have mobility issues and require accessibility standards. Even if they don't have a diagnosed disability, they still definitely require and benefit from accessibility measures. And currently, Nova Scotia has more seniors than youth, and not only youth, but newcomers as well. So what we're seeing, and the point of us bringing these statistics to the table, is that more people are leaving our workforce than are coming in. And we're seeing these big gaps. So one of the advantages of inclusion is to fill those gaps and to make sure that people are aware of organizations like reachAbility who have all of these wonderful clients and really capable and able clients who are looking for work, meaningful work. So as baby boomers are moving through their 60s and they're beginning to retire, the number of young people and newcomers that are coming into our workforce and into our province is actually insufficient to meet this demand. So again, we're seeing these gaps. We're seeing employers kind of scrambling and thinking, I need to get people working in my business. I have a need for that. So this is why employers and organizations who recognize the talent of our disability community and people living with disabilities, they understand and they're actually at an advantage, right? They're ahead of this curve. They're filling these gaps because they understand, okay, there are job seekers out there who maybe I've looked over in the past, or maybe I've kind of made an assumption that they couldn't do this job. And that's why we call our disability community the untapped workforce. And the reason is because they often get looked over in our hiring practices. So this untapped workforce, our disability community, we often have these stereotypes or assumptions or generalizations or even labels that we place onto them. And we usually do it unconsciously and unintentionally, of course, but it still has detrimental effects. So we want to make sure, it's okay if we thought that way in the past. We're thinking new now. We're growing in our knowledge, and now we are tapping in to this untapped workforce. So businesses and organizations who challenge these assumptions or who organize training, for example, our IIA training, to help challenge these assumptions and get accurate and up-to-date information and education from people and from those first-person voices who we do include, they're already ahead of this wave that's coming, this tsunami almost that's coming. So oftentimes businesses like you to come with facts, right? They want you to come with real statistics that they can say, okay, I understand maybe from my heart why it's important to be inclusive and accessible, but how is this actually going to increase my business? How is it going to help my business? And so we like to present some facts. These are Canada-based facts, but Nova Scotia, of course, is a part of Canada, so we're included in this too. So there was research that was actually published back in 2016 from Fortune Magazine and Simmons Market Research Bureau about the disability community in Canada. And this was to help businesses challenge that old mindset that, people with disabilities, they live in supportive housing. They're not necessarily the people who are out accessing our services and buying our goods. And even though for some of us that might sound awful, that's actually a really commonly held old stereotype that we still see present today. And so presenting these facts really helps challenge that. It's like our own little version of Mythbusters that we like to present these facts to help with. So out of the disability community in Canada, almost half are principal shoppers for their household. So again, that helps blast that stereotype that everyone who has a disability lives in supportive living and there's someone doing their shopping for them. That's not true. For some people it is, but that's not true for the whole disability community. Almost half are married again. So again, there's another assumption that we're helping blast, which is people with disabilities, they can't access weddings or wedding venues. And even though that is true, that's not their fault. It's because our venues and our systems are inaccessible. 77% have disposable income. Again, that one comes from this assumption and stereotype that people who have disabilities really don't have a lot of extra money because they're receiving a disability benefit or something like that, or they're not able to work. And that's simply not true. And almost 60% own their own homes. So if you're a business who helps with the building of or maintaining of a home, you're actually missing out on a lot of business by being inaccessible or non-inclusive. And so businesses usually start to perk up after you give them these figures and these numbers. And specifically with this one, I love to present this statistic. So everyone here probably knows someone who owns a business or who works somewhere and does hiring, or who cares about, maybe a small business owner here in Nova Scotia. So I love asking the question, if there were an untapped multi-billion-dollar market, would you want to know about it? And the answer is, of course. Even if you're not a business owner, that's curious. You're like, what is this? What is this untapped market? Would you want to know if you were unintentionally preventing those customers from doing business with you? Again, a resounding yes, of course. I want to tap into this untapped market. So this market, this untapped market, in the same way that we say this untapped potential in our workforce, is actually Canadians living with disabilities. And because 1 in 5, the statistic in Canada is a little less than Nova Scotia, but 1 in 5 Canadians self-identifies as having a disability, which represents a purchasing power worth $55 billion annually. So this isn't small potatoes that we're missing out on when we're inadvertently inaccessible and non-inclusive. And it's not just the people in the disability community who are impacted by this. You have to consider their extended networks, like their family, friends, maybe travel companions or their support workers. So if your business is inaccessible, you're not just leaving out the person with the disability, you're leaving out their whole network as well, their social network. And I talk to a lot of people throughout the years of presenting ODE who live with somebody or who have a loved one with a disability. And they'll tell me, even if I'm not with my person who I love, who has a disability, I still won't go into an inaccessible space. Even if I can access it, I'll still choose to take my business elsewhere because I want to support businesses who are focusing on accessibility and inclusion measures. Okay, so I'm going to get into talking a little bit about our Accessibility Act. So it came in 2017. So if you're unfamiliar, it can be a lot of information to take in, but that's okay because I'm going to be giving you my contact at the end of this. And also you can head on over to our YouTube page and ask any questions you want and I'll address them at the end. So if it goes a little bit fast or it's a lot of information to absorb, that's okay. So right before we got our act in 2017, there was a survey that went out to Government of Nova Scotia employees, and the survey had one question. And the question was, what does accessibility mean? And we included this in this program because it's so important to know that Nova Scotians, even before we got our act, were already understanding and educated and on board with the importance and benefit of accessibility. And so they broke down the answers that they got. They got over 1,700 responses. And they broke down and categorized the answers into these 5 categories. And I love showcasing this because when I ask people the question, what does accessibility mean? I get kind of the the assumptive or the generalized version, which is, we have to physically be accessible. We have to make sure our physical spaces are accessible. And people often don't think beyond that. And like I mentioned, that's such a foundation to accessibility. We got to get people into our buildings in order to access our services. But accessibility, as Nova Scotians have so eloquently pointed out here, means a lot more than that. So the responses from people said that it means being inclusive and equitable. And we're going to talk about the difference a little bit later between being equitable and offering equal services. It also means being barrier-free. So again, we're going to talk a little bit later about accommodations, and being able to offer accommodations and make accommodations is so wonderful. However, we want to move forward to a place where people with disabilities can be independent and make decisions and participate on their own without always having to be accommodated. Again, accommodations are wonderful when they can be made, but we want to move toward a structure and system and society where people can just choose. They don't need accommodations all the time. They can just access things because our systems are barrier-free. Accessibility also means being safe and respectful. So those are two things you probably wouldn't have considered right off the bat if I asked you, what does accessibility mean? So if I walk into your business or organization and I don't feel respected or safe there, that's an inaccessible space for me. I'm certainly not going to be back, and I'm probably going to spread the word that you don't want to go here. This is not a place of safety. It also means being educated and aware. So participating in training like NAAW, like that we've offered all week, making sure that you're up to date and educated and aware, even if you don't know somebody who has a disability. That's kind of the crucial piece to making sure that you are up to date and aware. So if you don't know someone who's a first person voice, participating in trainings like these is very important. And being proactive, the last one. So being proactive specifically with accessibility means we are considering inclusion and accessibility in the first part of our designing of systems and structures and policies too, rather than at the end. So what we're seeing right now is we have a lot of backpedaling to do for the last, few hundred years of inaccessible spaces. So we want to make sure moving forward that accessibility is not just a quick little add-in at the end. It's considered first and foremost. Okay, so like I mentioned, in 2017, on April 27th, Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act was passed. And this is always a surprising statistic when I tell people, because sometimes we get into this mindset that Nova Scotia is old and behind the times, and everywhere else is advanced and they're moving forward and we're kind of stuck in our ways. But Nova Scotia was actually only the third Canadian province to implement accessibility legislation. So out of all of our provinces, we were number 3, and Ontario and Manitoba were first. So our goal with the accessibility legislation and the Act is that we recognize, of course, accessibility is a basic human right, but also we have set a goal of an accessible province by 2030, which is an ambitious goal, and there's lots of work that's being done and soon to be implemented. So we have the Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate, and we also have the Accessibility Advisory Board. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a couple slides here. So with the Act, currently, the government developed 6 accessibility standards. So 6 areas where we are actually going to focus all of our efforts and energy into talking about inclusion and accessibility. So 6 categories, and I'm going to give you that breakdown now. So the first one, of course, is built environment. We want to make sure our infrastructure is accessible. So standards in this area are addressing how to prevent but also remove barriers to make buildings, streets, sidewalks, rights of way, and any other shared spaces accessible to all. And this includes where people live, work, learn, and play. So all of our buildings, all of our outside points of access, all of those shared spaces that we have to make them as accessible as possible, fully accessible. Now, this was actually the first standard, one of the first 2 standards that is being worked on, or that has been being worked on since 2017. And they actually have their own standard development committee. So the Built Environment Standard Development Committee, The majority of the members are actually first-person voices, so people who are living with disabilities. And that was actually something that was in the Act, mandatory component of the Act, because we want to make sure that the people who we're making these decisions about, that it's actually appropriate and going to benefit them. That just makes sense, of course. And in August 2020, so one of the more recent updates, I think there were 68 recommendations that were submitted for review. So they are going to the Accessibility Advisory Board, as well as the Minister of Justice. So they're going to be working together to implement all of these recommendations that have come over the last few years. So some of the built environment recommendations are in the categories of parking, accessible parking, pedestrian facilities, exterior approaches, so how our outdoor spaces can be more accessible, emergency systems, site selections, signage, washrooms, of course, interiors, housing and residence, and parks and recreation. So all of the recommendations for accessibility have been made in those different categories. And what you'll see is that the implementation of these recommendations will be starting in 2022. So very soon, we're going to be seeing some changes. The second standard is in education. And oftentimes people, when you think of education, you think of like the school building, but that's actually built environment. So education is a little bit different. Education is actually how students will get the instruction and learning materials that they need. So how we can teach people with disabilities who maybe learn in different ways or unique ways, and make sure that they get all of the materials and lessons that they need, just like everybody else can. So making sure that we create barrier-free learning environments for students in public schools, but also private institutions as well, like colleges and universities. So these standards are going to address how all students with disabilities get everything that they need to be able to participate and learn. And this requires an education system that prioritizes the knowledge and leadership of marginalized communities as well. The goal is meaningful participation of all learners and educational policies, programs, practices, and services that are inclusive, flexible, and responsive. So the education standard also has its own standards development committee, and they have been working for the last few years to make recommendations to our education minister and to the board to review, to increase things like capacity building, inclusive teaching and learning, accessibility services, research, accountability, communication, and navigation. So again, they're working with community members, but also the board members, who the majority are people living with disabilities. The third standard is employment, something obviously very near and dear to our heart at reachAbility, as we have our employment supportive programs. So the employment standards are going to support people with disabilities in finding meaningful and appropriate employment. And the goal is to ensure equal access to employment for persons with disabilities. So remember when I talked about that untapped workforce? The government is saying, let's tap in. We need to tap into this workforce. We have wonderful people who are capable and able to do many different jobs. And so we need to stop looking over them. We need to include them in our hiring practices. Number 4 is goods and services. So the fourth standard. And standards for delivering and receiving our goods and services are going to address the use of things like assistive devices when accessing services, how goods and services are obtained, and also training, so specific training on how to serve people with disabilities. And I love to give people the example. They'll say, well, what's an example of a goods and service and offering in an accommodated way? Like, what does that mean? And I love giving the example. I have a friend who is a massage therapist, and I say, when I go for a massage, I can, disrobe, jump up on the table, have my massage, leave, and go home, just in a simple kind of everyday way. But not everyone is able to do that. So how can we think outside the box to make sure that someone with a disability is not missing out on the wonderful service and healing benefit of massage therapy, just because they can't do it in the traditional way that other people can, doesn't mean that we can't still offer them something so beneficial, just in an accommodated way. Number 5 is IT, so information and communication. So this standard is addressing how all Nova Scotians can share and receive the same information. So this could be business or organizations' websites, They might consider alternative formats. So for example, offering some of your materials in Braille, or having American Sign Language, someone who is an interpreter to offer sign language for an event. Plain language documents, that's an interesting one. So moving forward to using really concise, clear-cut language. And particularly in the legal field, they were doing a little bit of talking about this a few years ago. And someone said to me, have you ever tried to read a legal document? And I said, no. And they said, it's like another language. Like you almost have to learn the lingo. And not everybody either has the time or ability to do that. So why don't we just use plain language so the most amount of people can understand as possible? Or even offering large print. So that could be physically or online as well. Accessible websites and technologies, and any kind of standard for communicating with people with disabilities. So information and communication. And the last standard is transportation. So making sure that these standards are going to encourage people to make things easier for everyone to travel, both, of course, rurally and urban areas of Nova Scotia. Transportation that would fall under Federal Accessibility Act, so the ACA, which I'll talk a little bit briefly about in a few minutes, like air travel and rail travel, that doesn't fall under Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act. So just kind of a little tidbit there for you. So those are the 6 standards that we currently have. The Accessibility Act applies to the government first. So the government is going to be reviewing all of their own policies and infrastructure and procedures to make sure they implement accessibility because they want to lead by example. But the Act also applies to public and private sector organizations as well. The Act includes compliance and enforcement mechanisms. So there are going to be surveys and assessments done of spaces, not only spaces, but programming as well. And the provincial government, so you might not have known this might be new information to you, but our provincial government annually invests $1 million a year in accessibility grants for businesses and community organizations to become more accessible. So I'm going to give you a little breakdown of that so you know if you might benefit or someone you know might benefit from accessing this grant program to pass along this information. So the accessibility grants are through the Department of CCH in Nova Scotia, so Communities, Culture and Heritage. They are offering cost-shared grants. So they've been offering this since 2017. They started this program, and it was a quick response to Nova Scotia getting its Accessibility Act. And the response was sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes accessibility upgrading is expensive, or it can be. And so the government said, we want to make sure we're helping our Nova Scotia small and medium businesses to help cover some of that financial need. So cost-shared grants through the Department of CCH to make accessibility-related improvements for their customers and employees. So oftentimes people don't know that they can make their business space more accessible to hire someone with a disability that might need an accommodation or an accessibility feature. So the grants will cover 2/3 of eligible expenses, so 66%, and they're capped at certain amounts, and I'll go through those. I'll go through each of the capped amounts. The grants are limited to $100,000 per applicant per year, and that's the link. So if you go to that link, you'll see the application process, but also the application guidelines. So there's a whole breakdown you can read there of all the requirements and guidelines to not only applying, but receiving funding for accessibility measures. Right now, so right where we're at right now in June for 2021, we have about $600,000 of grant remaining. So CCH is recommending, if you are looking to apply, get those applications in by late fall, because the projects that need to be completed for funding, they need to do that before the end of the fiscal year, so March 31st, 2022. So if you are looking into or interested in learning more about a grant, we encourage people to start that process now as quick as you can, as quick as possible. So I'm going to give you some examples of what could be covered in the different categories of funding that you could receive an accessibility grant for. And what you'll notice is that these go they align very nicely with the standards that were laid out in the Act. So accessibility related improvements could fall under one or more of the following categories. So of course, number one, built environment. So we want to make sure we remove those physical barriers for our disability community, customers and employees to access all business services. So this could be improvements to the physical environment of a business, like curb cuts, accessible parking, making bathrooms more accessible, installing automatic door openers, or just creating barrier-free paths of travel. So making sure you have space, you're offering that space. So the grant funding for our built environment is a maximum of $50,000. That's the max that someone could receive. And again, it's 2/3, so about 66%. The next thing that a business could receive a grant for is for accessible communication and information sharing. So making sure that all of your customers, clients, and employees can access all the information related to your business. So this could be improvements relating to accessible web design, accessible signage, assistive technologies that allow someone who is blind or deaf or hard of hearing to communicate with your business. It could be conversion of commercial documentation into Braille or another format. It could be closed captioning of videos, or even fire alarms. Fire alarms could be included in this one as well. So the capped amount here is $30,000. That's the max that you could receive, as long as that's 2/3. So that 66% still applies. The next category of funding you could receive is for assistive devices. So the cool thing about this one is the grant not only covers the purchasing of the devices, but also the training of your employees to learn how to accurately and appropriately use those devices to make sure they are being used in the best way possible and the safest way possible. Because it's a great thing to have this wonderful new piece of accessible technology, but we need to know how to use it for sure. So the capped amount here is $30,000. And this could be for things like handrails, adaptive washroom fixtures. Those would fall under the built environment category. So these are for the assistive device category is more so for things like movable equipment. So page turners, adaptive switches, voice recognition programs, or even specialized door levers. Those are just some examples. That's not the whole exhaustive list. There's definitely more that could be covered under the assistive devices category. The second last one is accessible transportation. So whether that is purchasing a new vehicle or upgrading an existing vehicle to convert it into an accessible transportation vehicle. So that would not just be for someone who's driving it, but also for passengers as well. So this could be like a shuttle service, fleet vehicles, taxis, anything that would improve access to those services could be covered. So the maximum here, the capped amount is $20,000. And the last thing that you could receive a grant for is something called Universal Design Capacity Building. So this is to make sure that people are trained in the accessibility and inclusion field. So trainer fees, resources, hosting costs, project management costs, promotion. This one is a little bit different than the first four. So I would direct you to the CCH grant website to read a little bit more about this one. So some of you might have heard of the Rick Hansen certification training program that they offer. And we do have some people here in Nova Scotia who are trained in that and who do the training program. That's an example of something that someone could receive a grant for. So if you wanted someone on your team who was Rick Hansen certified to be able to go in and do assessments and surveys of spaces, this would be a grant that could cover some of that training. And if you're not a business, but you're a community-based organization, like a nonprofit or a Mi'kmaq band council, or a municipal service in a municipal field, you could receive a community accessibility grant. So this is for to make sure that not only our businesses are being supported, but community grants as well are being offered to nonprofits, municipalities, and our Mi'kmaq councils. So if you are if you do fall under that category of who can apply, you can also receive funding. So you don't just have to be a business. Okay, so talking about the ACA, the Accessible Canada Act came right after the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act. And the cool part of this is that Nationally, Canada actually consulted with Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and Ontario to talk about their Accessibility Act. So what we were doing, what has been working, what hasn't, and they developed their act based on the 3 provinces that already had their own act. So I think that's pretty cool that Nova Scotia was a leader in helping Canada develop their own act as well. So the people who fall under the ACA, or who would have to comply with the ACA measures, are Parliament, any Government of Canada services and agencies, anyone who's federally regulated in the private sector, and of course our Canadian Forces and RCMP. So those are the people who would fall under the ACA. But what you'll see actually is that the ACA standards are very similar to Nova Scotia's. So oftentimes people who have taken ODE in the past will say, okay, but if I do all of my upgrading and updating based on Nova Scotia standards, is Canada going to come in with a bunch of new standards and say I have to do it all over again differently? And the answer is absolutely not. You'll see that they're very aligned and very supportive of one another, both of the acts. So when I show you just a little a breakdown of what they have released, a poster that the ACA released, you'll see the categories are very similar to the breakdown I gave you of Nova Scotia Accessibility Act. So they have their own Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization, just like Nova Scotia has its advisory board and its directorate as well as the Built Environment and Education Standards Boards. Their motto, which I love, is nothing about us without us. So making sure, again, that we're not making decisions about people without actually contacting and making sure those decisions are going to be appropriate for those people. That just makes sense. And National Accessibility Week came out of the ACA. So what we've been hosting for this last week in the last 3 years is something that was a result of Canada getting its own Accessibility Act. And one of the updates, if you were able to catch the event with Carla Qualtrough and our CEO, Tova Sherman, Carla said something that really hit me, and I updated it to a NAAW 2021 update for ODE, which was nothing without us. So instead of saying nothing about us without us, let's just stop making decisions without consulting members in our community who represent a large portion of our population, which is the disability community. So Carla, if you're watching, I really loved that shortened version, let's just make it nothing without us. Absolutely. And I really think, our society is nothing without including these populations that often get marginalized. Oh, and something really new that the ACA just kind of just released recently for NAAW 2021 is something called the Accessibility Data Hub. And this came from StatsCan as well as the Employment and Social Development Department of Canada. So they just unveiled the new Accessibility Data Hub. So if you're looking for data and information related to accessibility, or you're looking for like tables or infographics, government data, as well as laws related to accessibility, this is a one-stop shop that they've created. So if you go to the Accessibility Data Hub, you'll be able to find all of the information related to disability and accessibility in Canada. So it's just kind of like that one single point of access for all of this information, which I thought was a really neat thing that they released this year. I was excited to talk about that. So these are the 2 posters that the ACA released back in 2017. Actually, I think these are from 2018, right after the act was implemented. And so what you'll see here, I know it's hard to read. You can, if you go to the ACA website, you can blow these up and expand them. But on the right-hand side, you'll see the different standards that they've developed, and very, very similar to Nova Scotia's standards. So you can see how those acts really did grow from one another and took the lead from Nova Scotia. So built environment, employment, information and technology, communication, transportation, procurement, service design and delivery, all very similar to our standards as well. So oftentimes people will ask, it's great to have the education and information and knowledge, which is absolutely mandatory, but what can I do? What are some tangible actions that I can do? And we talk about accommodation a lot. And I mentioned earlier How accommodation for some people can be a really scary word. People shy away from it. People don't want to talk about it. And that in itself, the shying away from it, creates more barriers. So we like to, at reachAbility, talk about the ease of accommodation, how easy and simple sometimes it can be to be an accommodating employer or business or organization. Because any change or any shift in the environment that allows a person with a disability, impairment, or barrier to participate or be engaged is considered an accommodation. So accommodations can be temporary, they can be periodic, or they can be long-term, depending on the condition and the request. So some statistics that came from Canada about workplace accommodations specifically for employees with disabilities. About 1 in 3, so 37% of employees in Canada require at least one workplace accommodation to be able to do their job. So when we talk about accommodation and people feel a little bit nervous, I guarantee if you're an employer, you're probably already offering some form of accommodation to someone and you didn't even know it. So a lot of the accommodations that we provide people can be unconscious, but some of them are very intentional. They've been asked for and requested and also received. So 3 of the most common workplace accommodations in Canada that have been measured are flexible work arrangements, workstation modifications, and human or technical supports. So those are the top 3. And just to give you some more examples of other types of accommodations that could be made in a workplace, modified hours or days or reduced work hours, different duties, a special chair or a physical support, a modified or ergonomic workstation. I've been practicing for a few years how to say ergonomic. I still don't think I say it right, but I hear that word a lot. Working from home. So we've seen that over the last year and a half, right? It has forced some people into that situation. So for people who have needed that accommodation, we're realizing, how accessible it really can be for people to work from home. Maybe a computer, with specialized software, a human support, accessible parking, technical aids, accessible elevators, handrails, ramps, widened doorways or hallways, communication aids and supports, adapted washrooms, specialized transportation, or other work arrangements. So other things that were agreed upon. So these are just some examples from StatsCan of accommodations that have been requested or have been given. So some actions, some actual specific things that we can start doing to become more accessible in ways that maybe you haven't thought of or considered before. And we like to present these kind of simple and easy ways to alleviate that stress and that anxiety about, accommodations, oh my goodness. It's really not always a big deal or a big deal that we have made it to be. So here are some accessibility examples that you might consider, or I hope we put on your radar. So maybe menus, if you're somebody who offers a menus that are large print, so having a few, or compatible with e-reading software, or maybe offering some magnifying sheets. So those are at Staples. I think there's 10 in a pack for like $3. Lower counter heights, so maybe just in one section if you can't do the whole counter. Again, plain and concise language, contract, and documents. So making sure that, if you are having a hard time reading it and you're not someone who identifies as having a disability, imagine someone who had a cognitive disability or a learning challenge, trying to get through that contract or document. So having that on your radar, really important. Well-lit pathways and common spaces. So if your business has like a darker ambiance, which is nice, making sure that you still have those spaces that are clear. If somebody had like a vision impairment, or maybe they had a mobility issue and they needed to make sure they can see everything. Allowing a section for service animals, if that's possible. So some people rely on their animals. Having straws available for drinks. So that one was in conflict kind of with our ecological goals a few years ago, but some people have disabilities that prevent them from being able to drink from a cup or a glass. So having straws available just for when somebody might need it. Accessible washrooms with clearly marked signs and exit points, or even small flashlights for reading a menu or navigating those dimly lit ambiance spaces. So some inclusive practices, oftentimes these cost nothing. These are free. These are free ways of accommodating and making sure we're being inclusive, just as a first consideration. So a person who has low vision may need to have information read out loud to them. Again, free, doesn't cost anything. Someone who uses a scooter may need help finding an accessible route or a wheelchair. An individual with a learning disability may need to have instructions written down for them. A person who has a hearing impairment may need to know about any assistive listening devices, or if an interpreter will be present at a public meeting or event. A person who is unable to stand for a long period of time, they might benefit from having a little seating area where people might have to stand in line or wait for something and stand. A person with an intellectual disability may need assistance with and extra time to complete forms. Again, doesn't cost anything. These are free accommodations and ways that we can be inclusive. A person who's blind may be assisted by telling them the denominations of money being exchanged during a financial transaction. So that could be helpful for someone with a vision impairment. So some communication tips when you are speaking with somebody who has a disability. Speak directly to people. Don't avoid eye contact or speak only to their companions. So if somebody does have an interpreter, make sure you're still engaging and interacting with the actual person and not just their interpreter. Be patient and give your full attention to people who may have a difficulty communicating. Some people need more time to express themselves, and some people don't even have a disability and need that. So again, another way that all of these tips and all of these inclusion practices benefit everybody, right? This benefits everyone. If you don't understand someone, don't pretend like you do. So oftentimes we can shy away from wanting to get clarity because we're afraid to offend. I know Tova was talking about that in one of the NAAW events the other day with Dorico Simmons, which is, sometimes we think we're being nice and kind and friendly by, not wanting to address the elephant in the room, but that actually creates even more of a barrier, and it takes us away from learning something really crucial to work with this person. So ask a question. Tell them, I didn't catch that, or I didn't quite understand. Could you tell me a little bit more? There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's not offensive to get clarity. Some other communication tips: maintain respectful body language and facial expressions. So particularly if someone has a visible disability, avoid staring at them or making their disability the focus of conversation. So if they want to bring it up and educate you and talk about it, that's fine, but we don't want their whole identity, or what you're assuming their whole identity to be, just from what you see. Keep paper and a pen handy for exchanging notes with a person who is maybe hard of hearing or deaf or has a speech disability, or just anything else that might affect their communication. And when you're speaking with someone who is using an assistive device like a wheelchair or a scooter or anything else, it could be helpful to sit at their level, so to make eye contact at their level if possible, making the conversation easier. And please, please, please refrain from touching their assistive device. So unless they approve or unless they request, because oftentimes people's assistive devices are an extension of their body. So just like you wouldn't walk up and touch someone's body, please refrain from touching people's devices unless they request. And if you're speaking with someone who is blind or has a vision impairment, identify yourself and anyone else who's around in the environment as well, if someone's with you, and let the person know like when you're leaving or if you're walking away, because remember, they might not be able to see you, or they might not be able to see some visual cues that you might be giving, especially like facial expressions, right? Make sure that you understand that you need to be descriptive of these things. So use specific words or information or even directions, because keep in mind, the person might not be able to see you, like pointing to something or nodding your head. And offer to read printed material out loud if necessary. So those are just some ways, some kind of everyday, simple, easy ways that we can be more inclusive and more accommodating, and often either free or very low cost. So that's hopefully taking some of that fear out of accommodations and accessibility for a lot of people. Another term you might hear, or you might have heard, been used a lot in the last few years, because our focus and dedication has been to accessibility, is something called universal design. Again, it's not this big scary thing that people shy away from. All universal design means is that we want to make sure we're developing our systems so that they are as usable by as many people as possible. So again, another kind of reiteration that accessibility features don't just benefit the accessibility community, they benefit everyone. Everybody wins. It's a win-win-win when we are more inclusive and accessible. So making sure that everything is user-friendly and we have the best approach to include as many people as we can. So I said I would come back to this difference between equality and equity. And you might have seen these images before. They get used a lot. They're very common, but I love them because it really does show that difference between equality and equity. So oftentimes it's attractive for us to say, yes, everybody gets the same thing. We're equal. But when we take a step back and listen to that, we realize, well, not everybody needs the same thing. I don't need the same thing as you. You don't need the same thing as me. So why are we all getting the same thing? So equality sounds attractive, it sounds well-intentioned, and it very well is. But when we talk about equity, equity means giving people what they need to be able to succeed and to participate and do everything that we all are doing. And so sometimes people don't need a box, they need something else. However, if we are keeping the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act in mind, remember I mentioned earlier, our goal is to be barrier-free or as barrier-free as possible. So remember I said offering accommodations is wonderful if you're able to do it. If we move toward a barrier-free society, we don't need to, as you can see here from this image, constantly be offering accommodations. People can be independent and make their own choices and do what they want and need to do without having to be assisted. So I love those images because it does kind of give that visual representation of, you know, what does it look like to be barrier-free and the difference between equality and equity. Okay, so we've come to the end here. So a final reflection, just kind of as a takeaway for you to consider as you leave. Did you gain any new perspectives today? So has your perspective grown or shifted in any ways? What's your most important takeaway from today and from learning about all of this? And maybe even consider one thing that you'll do or think about differently moving forward and how that will affect not only how you treat people, but what you advocate for, because we're always looking to build our community of advocates for people living with disabilities as well and for accessibility and inclusion work. Okay, so I included my email on this slide, but you can certainly reach out to reachAbility at any time. Again, if you have any questions, please head on over to our YouTube page now, and I will be here for a little bit to do some Q&A. So I'm just going to check in with Jessica to see if she's been texting me any questions. And I will be here. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Again, if you missed part of this or you, for some reason, didn't catch the whole thing, or you wanted to see it again for some reason, you can tune in tomorrow. So it's going to be shown, this exact presentation will be shown again tomorrow at 10 a.m. on our YouTube channel. And please, too, we have one final event tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And it's going to be talking about some things that we addressed here, but the accommodation piece and disclosure piece in the workplace. So we're going to have HR professionals coming in and talking about, you know, educating us on what and how to disclose regarding disabilities and barriers in the workplace. So please tune into that tomorrow, 2 o'clock if you can. And that's our last event for NAAW. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming on board and challenging yourself, and hopefully you're more educated and aware and perhaps even enlightened. Thank you again. My name is Amanda, and I'll be here for some questions. So take care. Okay, thank you. So we are here, and I have a few questions that have come in from our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Jess. So the first one says, I'm curious, if I need to update my website and communication, can someone help me figure out what I'm supposed to change? I'm no accessibility pro. Yes, absolutely. So if you would like to reach out, we actually have a list of people who do accessibility work and are accessibility experts. So who do built environment work, but also IT work. So if you want to reach out to reachAbility, we have a few directions and a few names that we can give you. And one of them specifically for website configuration, accessibility configuration, her name is Lisa Snyder, and she owns a business called Access Changes Everything. ACE, Access Changes Everything, Lisa Snyder. So she does a ton of online accessibility work. She's actually, the last time I spoke to her, she was out of Halifax and Calgary. So she was moving back and forth. So if anyone has any questions, they can reach out to us, or they can look up Access Changes Everything through Lisa Snyder. The second question here says, is it best to be able to provide an accommodation upon request? Or should I be prepared by making these changes, i.e. menu, font size, etc., to everything so it's always available? That's a really good question too. So with menus specifically, we like to say that you might not update every single menu, but definitely have a handful of them available. And being proactive means doing things ahead of the curve. So I think this is a wonderful question. So considering accessibility, even though it hasn't been requested or specifically needed, considering all of these upgrades and ways that you can grow is a way of being proactive and staying ahead of this curve. So yes, definitely making changes before they're needed, absolutely a process that we encourage as well. But also staying open, right? Sometimes we make those changes and then somebody needs something additional. So staying open-minded to always continuing to learn and grow. Yeah, wonderful question there. And the last one that I've received says, I'm wondering, what kind of accommodations employers could provide for people with invisible disabilities, such as mental health, learning disabilities, cognitive impairments, etc.? Yeah, another wonderful question. So I would say, first of all, of course, that's case by case. Some people have unique requests or unique accommodations. Sometimes having like a mental health support in the workplace or an EAP. So some companies will have a program where someone can call in through their insurance and they can receive counseling, or having someone on staff who is, we call it now, someone who is educated and aware in mental health is being trauma informed. So making sure that your staff, but also people who are in charge, are trauma informed. And trauma informed doesn't, again, just benefit people who've gone through trauma. It benefits anyone who might be going through challenging times. So making sure you and your staff are trauma informed, whether you need to take training or not. Making sure an EAP could be available if possible. That would be a wonderful way of accommodating cognitive or mental health disabilities. But again, just staying open-minded, making sure to have those conversations and making them a normal part of your workplace culture so that it's not like, again, this big scary thing that we avoid, just making it part of the daily routine of things that we talk about. I hear mental health talked about way more now than it was even 10 years ago. So we are making making progress and making it normal and accepted and just something that, is a natural, everyday, organic thing that we talk about. Yes, but definitely staying open and maybe even asking, maybe even having that staff meeting and saying, we're working toward being a more accommodating and inclusive employer. So maybe the staff can let us know if there's any areas that they think we could do better or provide some sort of support or accommodation. Please know that we are open and willing and dedicated to that. And that's wonderful too, because then sometimes people shy away from requesting an accommodation because they think, oh, I'll never get that, or, oh, I don't want to put them out of the way. But once you normalize that conversation and say, hey, we are here to accommodate, we're here to include you, and we want you to be as comfortable as possible. Sometimes just that conversation and knowing that you are a safe person that someone can go to request something, that can make all the difference. Yeah, wonderful questions. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to wrap up. Again, if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to me directly. You can type them in our YouTube channel, or you can just reach out to reachAbility, and we can certainly point you in the right direction and help you with any accessibility or inclusion needs you have. Thank you so much for joining today. My name's Amanda. I hope you can join us tomorrow to wrap up a wonderful week of National Accessibility Week here in Nova Scotia. Thank you so much. Take care.